Sometimes the most dangerous words aren't threats or curses, they're whispered confessions that slip out when someone thinks no one is listening. On a remote ranch where the nearest neighbor lives 20 miles away, where the only sounds are cattle lowing and wind through prairie grass, such words can echo for a lifetime. Sarah Mitchell thought she was alone when she spoke those 4 words to the empty barn. She thought the only witness was her horse, standing patiently as she brushed away tears and years of buried longing. But ranchers learn to move quietly, to observe without being seen. And some secrets, once heard, change the course of 2 lives forever. What happens when a man who has spent 15 years respecting boundaries suddenly discovers that those boundaries were never wanted in the first place? When duty and desire collide on 8,000 acres of Montana grassland, the results can be as unpredictable as a summer storm and just as impossible to stop once they begin. This is the story of words that should never have been spoken, heard by ears that were never meant to listen, leading to choices that would transform everything 2 people thought they knew about love, sacrifice, and the courage it takes to reach for what you've always wanted but never dared to touch. The morning mist hung over the Mitchell ranch like a gray blanket, softening the edges of the sprawling Montana landscape. Sarah Mitchell stood at the kitchen window, watching the sun struggle through clouds as she gripped her coffee mug with both hands. At 42, she had learned that some days required extra caffeine and a few moments of stillness before facing the world. Her husband Robert had left before dawn for the cattle auction in Billings, leaving her alone on their 8,000-acre spread. Well, not entirely alone. Jake Sullivan would arrive within the hour to begin the day's work. Jake had been their ranch foreman for 15 years, hired just 6 months after she and Robert married. He was Robert's closest friend and, if Sarah was honest with herself, the steady presence that made their isolated life bearable. She finished her coffee and headed to the barn to check on Moonbeam, her aging mare who had been favoring her left front leg. The vet would arrive later that morning, but Sarah wanted to assess the situation first. As she walked across the dewy grass, her boots leaving dark prints in the silver moisture, she let her mind wander to the conversation she had avoided having with Robert for months. The ranch was struggling financially. Feed costs had skyrocketed, and 2 consecutive years of drought had reduced their grazing land to stubble and dust. Robert worked 18-hour days trying to keep them afloat, his face growing more haggard with each passing month. He barely spoke anymore except to discuss ranch business, and even then, his responses were clipped and distant. Sarah understood the pressure he faced. What she couldn't understand was how he had stopped seeing her entirely. She had become invisible in her own home, a piece of furniture that prepared meals and managed household accounts. When was the last time he had really looked at her? When was the last time they had talked about anything other than cattle prices and weather reports? The barn was dim and cool, smelling of hay and horse. Moonbeam nickered softly as Sarah approached her stall, extending her neck for the customary scratch behind the ears. Sarah obliged, running her fingers through the mare's silvery mane. "You're getting old, girl," she murmured. "We both are. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd made different choices." She moved around to examine Moonbeam's leg, gently lifting the hoof to check for stones or inflammation. The mare stood patiently, trusting completely in Sarah's touch. It struck her suddenly how long it had been since anyone had touched her with such gentleness, such care. The thought opened a door in her mind that she usually kept firmly closed. Images flashed unbidden: Jake's calloused hands as he mended fence wire, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the morning 2 weeks ago when she had found him repairing the porch railing that Robert had promised to fix for months. He had looked up at her approach, sweat beading his forehead, and, for a moment their eyes had held longer than necessary. "Stop it," she whispered to herself, but the memories continued flowing. Jake bringing her wildflowers he claimed he had picked for decorating the house. Jake listening intently when she talked about the books she was reading, asking thoughtful questions that showed he valued her opinions. Jake being present in all the ways her husband was absent. The physical longing hit her like a physical blow. 15 years of careful distance, of maintaining appropriate boundaries, of pretending she didn't notice how his presence lit up her day. 15 years of lying to herself about what she felt. Moonbeam shifted restlessly, sensing Sarah's agitation. Sarah steadied herself against the stall door, overwhelmed by the sudden intensity of emotions she had suppressed for so long. I can't keep doing this, she said aloud, her voice barely audible in the stillness. Living like I'm already dead inside. Going through the motions of a marriage that ended years ago. The words hung in the air like a confession to the empty barn. Sarah looked around at the familiar surroundings, the hay bales stacked to the rafters, the tack room where Jake had hung bridles with military precision, the workbench where he sharpened tools and fixed whatever needed fixing. This barn held more warmth than her own house. He cares about me, she continued, speaking to Moonbeam as if the horse could understand. I know he does. I see it in the way he brings me tea when I'm working late on the books. The way he remembers things Robert forgot years ago. But he's too honorable to ever cross that line. Too loyal to Robert. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to imagine for just a moment what it would feel like to be truly seen again. To have someone look at her the way Jake sometimes did when he thought she wasn't paying attention. To feel desired instead of merely tolerated. I yearn, she whispered, the words escaping like a prayer. I yearn for something real. Something alive. I yearn for him to see that I'm dying here, piece by piece, and I need, her voice broke slightly. I need someone to untie me from this life that's strangling me slowly. The sound of approaching footsteps on gravel made her freeze. Through the barn's side window, she could see Jake's familiar silhouette walking toward the building, earlier than expected. Panic flooded through her as she realized he might have heard her confession. How long had he been outside? How much had he witnessed? She busied herself checking Moonbeam's water bucket, trying to compose her features into the calm mask she wore around Jake. But her hands shook as she filled the bucket from the hose, and her heart hammered against her ribs. Jake appeared in the barn doorway, his tall frame backlit by the morning sun. At 45, he remained lean and strong from years of physical labor, his dark hair now showing silver at the temples. He wore his usual work clothes, faded jeans, cotton shirt rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle, boots that had seen 1,000 days of hard use. Morning, Sarah, he said, his voice carrying an odd quality she couldn't identify. How's Moonbeam's leg looking? Better, I think, she replied, not trusting herself to meet his eyes. Dr. Peterson will be here around 10 to take a proper look. Jake nodded and moved to the tack room, but Sarah noticed he moved differently than usual. There was a tension in his shoulders, a careful deliberation in his movements that suggested he was thinking about something other than the day's work. Robert get off all right, he asked from the tack room, his voice muffled by the wooden walls. Yes, before sunrise. He should be back by evening. Jake emerged with a bridle that needed cleaning, but instead of sitting at the workbench as he usually did, he leaned against the stall door across from where Sarah stood. The position forced her to look at him, and, when their eyes met, she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. His dark eyes held an intensity she had never seen before, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time. There was question there, and something that might have been longing, carefully controlled but unmistakably present. Sarah, he said quietly, her name falling from his lips like a revelation. We need to talk. The words sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. He had heard her. Everything was about to change, and she wasn't sure she was ready for the consequences of having her deepest feelings exposed. Jake, I'm not here, he interrupted gently. After Dr. Peterson leaves. Meet me at the old line cabin by Cedar Creek. There are things we need to say that can't be said where others might hear. He set down the bridle and walked out of the barn without another word, leaving Sarah alone with Moonbeam and the echo of her whispered confession that had changed everything. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the mist and revealing the sharp edges of a landscape that suddenly felt charged with possibility and danger. As she stood in the empty barn, Sarah realized that 15 years of careful distance was about to end. Whatever happened next, there would be no going back to the safe pretense that had governed their relationship. The door she had kept locked for so long had been blown open by 4 desperate words, and now she had to decide whether she had the courage to walk through it. The sound of Dr. Peterson's truck approaching brought her back to the immediate present, but her mind remained fixed on the afternoon meeting that would determine the course of the rest of her life. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive, terrified and exhilarated in equal measure by the knowledge that everything she had yearned for might finally be within reach if she was brave enough to claim it. The old line cabin sat in a grove of cottonwoods beside Cedar Creek, about 3 miles from the main house. Built by Robert's grandfather in the 1940s, it had served as temporary shelter for cowboys during roundups and branding seasons. Now it stood empty most of the year, its weathered logs and sagging porch a reminder of simpler times when the ranch supported 3 families instead of struggling to support one. Sarah approached on horseback, having told herself she needed to check the fence line along the creek. The excuse felt hollow even to her own ears. She knew exactly why she was riding toward the cabin, and it had nothing to do with fence maintenance. Dr. Peterson's examination of Moonbeam had revealed nothing more serious than a minor strain that would heal with rest and anti-inflammatory medication. Sarah had nodded and smiled appropriately, but her mind had been elsewhere, counting down the hours until her meeting with Jake. Now, as the afternoon sun slanted through the cottonwood leaves, she felt her stomach twist with nervous anticipation. Jake's horse was already tied to the hitching post outside the cabin. Through the single window, she could see his silhouette moving inside. He had arrived first and was waiting for her, just as she had somehow known he would be. Jake Sullivan was nothing if not reliable. She dismounted and tied her own horse next to his, noting how the 2 animals immediately moved closer together, seeking companionship in the way horses do. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. For 15 years, she and Jake had maintained careful distance while gravitating toward each other in countless small ways. The cabin door opened before she could knock. Jake stood framed in the doorway, having changed out of his work clothes into clean jeans and a button-down shirt. The effort he had made to look presentable for this conversation touched her more than she expected. "Come in," he said, stepping aside to let her pass. The cabin's interior was sparse but clean. Someone, probably Jake, had swept out the dust and cobwebs and brought in 2 chairs from the ranch's storage shed. A thermos and 2 cups sat on the small wooden table that had witnessed countless card games and conversations over the decades. "Coffee?" Jake offered, gesturing toward the thermos. Sarah nodded, grateful for something to do with her hands. As he poured, she noticed his movements were more careful than usual, as if he was thinking about each action before performing it. "Jake," she began, but he held up a hand. "Let me start," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "Because I've been rehearsing what to say for the last 4 hours, and if I don't get it out now, I might lose my nerve." He took a sip of coffee, then set the cup down and looked directly into her eyes. The intensity of his gaze made her feel exposed, as if he could see every secret she had ever harbored. "I heard what you said in the barn this morning," he said quietly. "Every word. And I need you to know that I wasn't spying or eavesdropping. I came early to fix the loose board in Moonbeam's stall, and your voice carried through the wood. By the time I realized I should leave, you had already said things that I can't pretend I didn't hear." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. The mortification of having her most private thoughts exposed was almost unbearable. "Jake, I'm so sorry." "I never meant for anyone to." "Don't apologize," he interrupted firmly. "Don't you dare apologize for being honest about your feelings. Do you know how long I've wondered if what I was seeing in your eyes was real or just wishful thinking on my part?" The question hung between them like a bridge she could choose to cross or burn. Sarah stared into her coffee cup, watching the dark liquid swirl as her hand trembled slightly. "What you're seeing is real," she admitted. "It's been real for years." "But, Jake, we can't." "Why can't we?" The question came out with surprising force. "Because Robert is my friend? Because I work for him? Because society says married women should be grateful for what they have even when what they have is slowly killing them?" Sarah looked up, startled by the passion in his voice. She had never seen Jake lose his composure, never heard him speak with such raw emotion. "You don't understand," she said. "Robert is a good man. He works hard to provide for us. The ranch has been struggling, and he's doing everything he can to." "Robert is a good man," Jake agreed. "But he's not a good husband. Not anymore. When was the last time he asked how you're feeling? When was the last time he noticed that you've lost weight because you're so unhappy you barely eat? When was the last time he touched you with anything resembling affection? The questions hit like physical blows because they forced her to confront truths she had been avoiding. She couldn't remember the last time Robert had touched her beyond perfunctory kisses goodbye. She couldn't remember the last time he had asked about her day or shown interest in her thoughts. That doesn't give me the right to what? To want more? To hope for happiness? Jake leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Sarah, I've watched you disappear piece by piece over the last 5 years. You used to sing while you worked in the garden. You used to laugh at my terrible jokes. You used to light up when you talked about the books you were reading. When was the last time I saw you truly smile? She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came. The truth was she couldn't remember the last time she had felt genuine joy. I've been in love with you for 8 years, Jake continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Maybe longer. I've fought it, ignored it, tried to convince myself it was just admiration or friendship. But, this morning, when I heard you say those words, when I heard the pain in your voice, I realized I've been a coward. I've been standing by watching the woman I love slowly suffocate, and I've done nothing to help her breathe. Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks before she could stop them. The relief of having someone acknowledge her pain was overwhelming. For so long, she had felt like she was drowning in plain sight while everyone around her pretended not to notice. I love you too, she whispered. I've loved you for so long it feels like forever. But, Jake, what you're suggesting, it would destroy everything. Robert would lose his best friend and his wife. The ranch would fall apart. People would talk, people already talk, Jake said gently. Do you think the folks in town don't notice how Robert treats you? Do you think they don't see how isolated you've become? Mrs. Henderson at the grocery store asks me about you every time I'm in town because she's worried. She says you look like a woman who's given up on life. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to process the idea that her misery was visible to others. She had thought she was doing a better job of hiding it. Even if that's true, she said, having an affair isn't the answer. I won't become that kind of person. I won't sneak around and lie and, I'm not talking about an affair, Jake interrupted. I'm talking about you leaving Robert and building a real life with someone who sees your worth. I'm talking about divorce and starting over. The word divorce hit her like a thunderclap. In her rural community, divorce was still spoken of in whispers, still carried a stigma that could follow a person for years. Her parents would be horrified. The church congregation would shun her. She would lose everything familiar and safe. I can't, she said automatically. I took vows. For better or worse, until death do us part. I meant those words when I said them. And, what about the vow Robert took to love and cherish you? Jake asked. When was the last time you felt cherished? When was the last time you felt like anything more than an unpaid housekeeper? The question struck home because they highlighted the one-sided nature of the commitment she was defending. She had spent 15 years honoring vows that her husband had essentially abandoned. Marriage isn't just about feeling cherished, she argued, but the words sounded weak even to her own ears. It's about commitment and working through difficulties and what happens when only one person is doing the work. Jake stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the creek that bubbled over smooth stones. Sarah, I've watched you try to save your marriage for years. You've cooked Robert's favorite meals hoping to bring back his smile. You've managed the ranch books to take pressure off him. You've given up friends and hobbies and dreams to support his vision of what your life should be. What has he given up? What effort has he made? Sarah couldn't answer because the truth was Robert had given up nothing. He had simply retreated into work and let their marriage wither while she struggled alone to keep it alive. I see your point, she said quietly. But leaving him now, when the ranch is struggling, when he needs what? Jake turned back to face her. When he needs a silent partner who asks for nothing and gives everything? When he needs someone to absorb his stress and frustration without complaint? That's not a marriage, Sarah. That's indentured servitude. The harsh words rang with uncomfortable truth. Sarah realized that somewhere along the way, she had stopped being Robert's wife and had become simply another ranch asset, valuable for her contribution but not particularly valued as a person. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I'm scared of the scandal and the gossip and the possibility of ending up alone. I'm scared of starting over at 42. I'm scared of discovering that what I think I feel for you is just desperation to escape my current situation." Jake returned to his chair and reached across the table to take her hands. His touch was warm and gentle, sending electricity up her arms. "I'm scared too," he said. "I'm scared of losing Robert's friendship. I'm scared of people thinking I'm a homewrecker who seduced an unhappy wife. I'm scared that 15 years of working this land means nothing if I have to leave. But I'm more scared of spending the rest of my life watching you fade away while I do nothing to save you." They sat in silence for several minutes, hands clasped across the table while creek water gurgled outside the window. Sarah felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her like a physical force. Stay in a marriage that was slowly killing her spirit, or take a leap of faith toward an uncertain but potentially joyful future. "If I were to leave Robert," she said finally, "if I were to consider divorce, what would that mean for us? Where would we go? How would we survive?" Jake's eyes brightened with hope. "I have money saved. Enough to start over somewhere else if we need to. I've been managing the Henderson spread as well as helping here, and they've made me an offer to take over as full partner. It's smaller than this place, but it's profitable and it's ours if we want it." "Ours," Sarah repeated, testing the sound of the word. The possibility of true partnership, of building something together instead of simply maintaining what someone else had created, was intoxicating. "Think about it," Jake said, squeezing her hands. "No more walking on eggshells. No more feeling invisible in your own home. No more pretending to be satisfied with scraps of attention and affection." As the sun began to set behind the cottonwoods, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. Real, tangible hope for a future that didn't involve slow suffocation. The terror was still there, but it was balanced now by the possibility of genuine happiness. "I need time," she said. "This isn't a decision I can make in one afternoon. If I'm going to do this, I need to do it right. I need to talk to Robert honestly about our marriage. I need to give him a chance to fight for what we have." Jake nodded, though she could see disappointment in his eyes. "How much time?" "A month. Let me try one more time to reach him, to see if there's anything left worth saving. If there isn't, if he won't even try to work with me, then I'll know I've done everything possible." "And if he does try? If he promises to change?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Then, I'll have to decide if I believe him and if it's too late for change to matter." As they prepared to leave the cabin, Jake pulled her into his arms for the first time in 15 years. The embrace was careful and gentle, but Sarah could feel the strength in his body and the tenderness in the way he held her. For just a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would feel like to be held this way every day. "Whatever you decide," he murmured into her hair, "know that you deserve better than what you have. Know that you're worth fighting for, even if Robert doesn't see it." As they rode back toward the ranch house separately, Sarah carried those words with her like a talisman. For the first time in years, someone had seen her worth and been willing to risk everything to claim it. Whether she would have the courage to claim him in return remained to be seen, but the seed of possibility had been planted, and she could already feel it beginning to grow. The dinner Sarah prepared that evening was Robert's favorite: pot roast with carrots and potatoes, cornbread fresh from the oven, and apple pie still warm enough to melt the vanilla ice cream she served alongside it. She set the table with their wedding china, lit candles, and even wore the blue dress Robert had once said brought out her eyes. It was a test, though Robert didn't know it. A final attempt to see if there was anything left of the man who had courted her 20 years ago, who had promised to love and cherish her until death parted them. If Jake's words about giving Robert a chance to fight for their marriage were to mean anything, she had to create an opportunity for that fight to begin. Robert arrived home just after sunset, his face bearing the familiar expression of exhaustion and frustration. The cattle auction had not gone well, she could read that in the set of his shoulders before he even spoke. He hung his hat on the hook by the door and washed his hands at the kitchen sink without seeming to notice the special meal or the carefully set table. "Bad day?" Sarah asked gently, filling his plate with generous portions. "Prices were down 15% from last month," he replied, settling into his chair with a heavy sigh. "Henderson got nearly twice what I did for cattle that weren't half as good as ours. Sometimes I think the whole system is rigged against small operations like ours." Sarah nodded sympathetically and took her own seat across from him. The candlelight flickered between them, creating an intimate atmosphere that felt forced and unnatural after years of eating in relative silence with only the television for company. "Maybe we should consider Henderson's offer to sell him the north pasture," she suggested carefully. "It would give us some breathing room financially, and we could focus our efforts on the core ranch land." Robert looked up from his plate with surprise, as if he had forgotten she was there. "Since when do you have opinions about ranch operations?" The question stung, though she tried not to show it. "I've always had opinions, Robert. I just haven't shared them because you've made it clear you prefer to handle business decisions alone." He paused with his fork halfway to his mouth, studying her face with something approaching genuine attention. "You look different tonight. Did you do something with your hair?" "I'm wearing the blue dress you used to like," she said, encouraged by the first personal observation he had made about her in months. "Do you remember? You bought it for me for our 5th anniversary." Robert's expression softened slightly. "I remember. You wore it to the Hendersons' barbecue, and every man there couldn't keep his eyes off you. Made me proud to be your husband." The past tense of his statement hit her like a physical blow. Made him proud, not makes him proud. As if that feeling belonged to a different lifetime. "Robert," she said carefully, "when was the last time you were proud to be my husband?" The question seemed to genuinely puzzle him. He chewed thoughtfully, considering his answer. "I'm always proud of you, Sarah. You keep the house running, manage the books better than I ever could, never complain about the long hours or the uncertainty. You're the best ranch wife a man could ask for." Ranch wife. Not wife, not partner, not beloved companion. Ranch wife, a role defined by function rather than relationship. "Is that how you see me?" she asked. "As the ranch wife who performs necessary functions?" Robert set down his fork and leaned back in his chair. "What's this about, Sarah? Why the fancy dinner and the questions? Are you unhappy about something specific?" The opening she had been hoping for appeared before her, and Sarah felt her heart race as she prepared to step through it. This was her chance to lay their problems on the table, to give Robert the opportunity to fight for their marriage. "I am unhappy," she said quietly. "I've been unhappy for a long time, and I don't think you've noticed." Robert's face showed genuine surprise. "Unhappy about what? The financial pressure?" "Because I'm doing everything I can to—" "Not about money," Sarah interrupted. "About us. About our marriage. About the fact that we've stopped being husband and wife and have become business partners who happen to share a bed." The candlelight played across Robert's weathered features as he processed her words. Sarah could see him mentally reviewing their recent interactions, perhaps recognizing for the first time how distant they had become. "I've been under a lot of stress," he said defensively. "The ranch is barely staying afloat, and I've been working 18-hour days trying to keep us from losing everything my family built." "I thought you understood that." "I do understand," Sarah replied. "What I don't understand is why that stress has to mean the end of our connection as a couple. We used to talk about everything, our dreams, our fears, our hopes for the future. When was the last time we had a real conversation about anything other than ranch business?" Robert considered this, his brow furrowed in concentration. "We talk all the time. We exchange information," Sarah corrected. "You tell me cattle prices, I tell you which bills need paying. That's not conversation, Robert. That's coordination." She could see him struggling to understand the distinction. The man across from her was intelligent and hard-working, but emotional subtlety had never been his strength. The fact that he couldn't see the difference between communication and connection was part of the problem. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, and she heard genuine confusion in his voice. I'm doing the best I can to provide for us, to keep this place running. If you need me to be more communicative, I can try. But, Sarah, I'm exhausted most days. By the time I come in from the fields, all I want is food and sleep. I want you to want more than that, Sarah said, feeling tears threaten. I want you to miss me when you're working. I want you to look forward to coming home to me, not just to food and sleep. I want to feel like I matter to you as a person, not just as someone who makes your life more convenient. Robert reached across the table and took her hand, the gesture awkward but sincere. You do matter to me. You're my wife. Of course you matter. But, his touch felt foreign, as if he was following instructions rather than expressing genuine affection. Sarah realized with devastating clarity that Robert cared about her the way he might care about a valuable piece of equipment, grateful for her function, concerned about her maintenance, but not emotionally invested in her well-being. Robert, she said gently, when was the last time you touched me because you wanted to, not because you felt you should? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Robert's face flushed, and he withdrew his hand. That's not a fair question, he said. We've been married 15 years. The honeymoon phase doesn't last forever for anyone. I'm not talking about honeymoon phase, Sarah persisted. I'm talking about basic affection. Basic desire to be close to your spouse. Do you even find me attractive anymore? Robert's hesitation before answering told her everything she needed to know. He was searching for the right thing to say rather than speaking from genuine feeling. You're a beautiful woman, he said finally. Any man would be lucky to have you. Again with the past tense, the emotional distance. He spoke about her as if she were someone else's wife, someone he could admire objectively without personal investment. But, do you want me? Sarah pressed. Do you look at me and feel desire? Do you think about making love to me during your long days in the fields? Robert's discomfort was palpable. Sarah, what's gotten into you tonight? These aren't the kinds of things we usually talk about. Maybe that's part of the problem, she replied. Maybe we should talk about these things. Maybe we should talk about the fact that we haven't made love in 4 months. Maybe we should talk about the fact that when we do, it feels more like obligation than passion. The words came out harder than she intended, but she didn't take them back. Years of swallowed resentment and unspoken needs had built pressure that demanded release. Robert stood up from the table, running his hands through his graying hair. I don't know what you want from me, he said. I work hard to provide for us. I don't drink, I don't gamble, I don't run around with other women. I'm faithful and responsible and those are good qualities, Sarah interrupted. They make you a good man, Robert. But they don't automatically make you a good husband. He turned to face her, his expression shifting from confusion to something approaching anger. So what are you saying? That I'm failing as a husband? That 15 years of marriage and everything I've given you doesn't count for anything? Sarah felt the conversation veering toward familiar territory, Robert's tendency to turn discussions of problems into attacks on his character. It was a defense mechanism that effectively shut down communication by making her feel guilty for expressing dissatisfaction. I'm saying that we've lost something important, she said carefully. I'm saying that I feel lonely in my own marriage, and I want to work together to find our way back to each other. I don't understand what you mean by lonely, Robert said. You're never alone. I'm here every day. The comment revealed so much about how differently they viewed intimacy. For Robert, physical presence equaled connection. The idea that someone could feel lonely while surrounded by people was foreign to him. Being physically present isn't the same as being emotionally available, Sarah explained. I can be sitting next to you and still feel completely alone if you're not really with me in spirit. Robert sat back down heavily, looking genuinely bewildered. I don't know how to be more emotionally available. I'm not good at talking about feelings and all that. I never have been. You knew that when you married me. I did know that, Sarah admitted. But I thought we would grow together, learn from each other. I thought you might become more comfortable with emotional intimacy over time, and I might become more practical and goal-oriented like you. Instead, we've just drifted apart." She could see Robert processing this information, trying to understand concepts that had never been part of his emotional vocabulary. The effort was visible on his face, but so was his confusion. "Tell me what to do," he said finally. "Give me a list of specific things I can change, and I'll work on them." The request broke Sarah's heart because it revealed both his genuine desire to improve their marriage and his complete lack of understanding about what that improvement would require. He was approaching their relationship problems like a ranch management issue: identify specific deficiencies and address them systematically. "It's not about a list, Robert. It's about caring enough to figure out what I need without being told. It's about noticing when I'm sad or excited or worried, and responding to those emotions. It's about being curious about my inner life." Robert stared at her as if she were speaking a foreign language. The concepts she was describing were so far outside his experience that he literally didn't know how to begin implementing them. "I do care," he said defensively. "If you're sad or worried about something, you can tell me. I'll help however I can." "But you shouldn't have to be told," Sarah replied. "After 15 years of marriage, you should be able to read my moods, notice when something is bothering me, show interest in my emotional state without being prompted." As she spoke the words, Sarah realized she was describing exactly what Jake did naturally. Jake noticed when she was tired and brought her tea without being asked. He remembered conversations they had weeks earlier and followed up with thoughtful questions. He paid attention to her moods and responded with appropriate concern or celebration. The contrast was devastating. "I'm not good at reading people," Robert said. "I never have been. My father wasn't much for emotional expression, and I learned to focus on actions rather than feelings. If you need something from me, you have to be direct about it." Sarah looked across the table at her husband, really looked at him, and saw a man who was genuinely doing his best within the limitations of his emotional capacity. He wasn't deliberately neglecting her needs, he simply lacked the awareness to recognize them. The realization was both liberating and heartbreaking. It freed her from the belief that his emotional distance was a reflection of her worth, but it also forced her to accept that he was unlikely to develop the emotional intelligence their marriage required, no matter how hard he tried. "Robert," she said softly, "do you love me?" "Of course I love you," he replied immediately. "You're my wife." "But how do you love me? What does that love feel like to you?" Again, the long pause while he searched for words. I care about your well-being. I want you to be safe and provided for. I appreciate everything you do to make our life work. I can't imagine being married to anyone else." Sarah nodded slowly. His definition of love was based on duty, compatibility, and habit rather than passion, desire, or emotional connection. It was the love one might feel for a valued family member rather than a romantic partner. "And what do you think love should feel like?" she asked. Robert shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know. I think love is about commitment and loyalty and working together toward common goals. The feelings part, that's not something I understand very well." The honesty in his response was painful but illuminating. Robert wasn't being deliberately cold or withholding, he simply experienced love differently than she did. His emotional range was narrower, his capacity for passion more limited. As the candles burned lower and the evening grew late, Sarah found herself mourning not just her marriage but also the man Robert might have been under different circumstances. With different parents, different role models, different cultural messages about masculinity and emotion, he might have developed the emotional tools their relationship needed. But he hadn't, and, at 53, fundamental change was unlikely. "Thank you for being honest with me," Sarah said finally. "I know these conversations are difficult for you." Robert looked relieved that the intensity was diminishing. "So are we okay? Have I addressed your concerns?" The question revealed how completely he had misunderstood the purpose of their conversation. He thought they were solving a problem rather than exploring whether their fundamental incompatibility could be overcome. "We're okay for tonight," Sarah said gently. "But, Robert, this can't be a one-time conversation. If our marriage is going to work, we need to keep talking about these things regularly. We need to keep working on building emotional intimacy. Robert nodded dutifully, but Sarah could see the resignation in his expression. He was agreeing to try something he didn't understand, value, or believe was necessary. As they cleaned up the dinner dishes together, moving around each other in the kitchen with practiced efficiency, Sarah felt the weight of her month-long deadline pressing down on her. 3 weeks remained before she had promised to give Jake an answer, and already she could see that Robert's efforts to change would be superficial and temporary. He was a good man doing his best, but his best wasn't enough to save their marriage. The recognition brought sadness rather than anger, sadness for both of them, trapped in a union that had stopped nurturing either of their souls. That night, as Robert fell asleep beside her within minutes of his head hitting the pillow, Sarah stared at the ceiling and allowed herself to imagine what it would feel like to sleep next to someone who desired her presence rather than merely tolerating it. Someone who would notice if she was awake and troubled, who would ask about her thoughts, who would care enough about her inner life to lose sleep over her well-being. For the first time since her conversation with Jake, she began to believe that she deserved such love and that staying with Robert was preventing both of them from finding the kinds of relationships that would truly fulfill them. The month she had promised to give their marriage was beginning to feel less like a gift and more like a formality, a way of ensuring she had exhausted every possibility before making the decision she already knew was inevitable. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in the kitchen loading the dishwasher after another silent breakfast. Robert had eaten his eggs and toast while reading cattle market reports on his tablet, offering only grunts in response to her attempts at conversation. The fancy dinner and emotional revelation of weeks past might never have happened for all the lasting effect it had produced. True to his word, Robert had tried to be more attentive. For exactly 4 days. He had asked about her day, complimented her cooking, even brought her wildflowers from the pasture on the second day. But the efforts felt mechanical, items checked off a mental list rather than expressions of genuine interest. By the end of the first week, he had reverted to his old patterns of emotional absence. Sarah had tried to be patient, to appreciate the small gestures and encourage his attempts at change. But watching him struggle with basic emotional awareness had been like watching someone try to speak a foreign language they had no aptitude for. The words were technically correct, but the meaning never quite translated. The sound of Jake's truck pulling into the yard brought her to the window. He climbed out of the cab with his usual easy grace, but Sarah noticed something different in his posture. There was a tension in his shoulders, a deliberation in his movements that suggested he was carrying news of some kind. She met him at the back door before he could knock. "Morning," she said, searching his face for clues about his mood. "Morning." His dark eyes held hers for a long moment, and she saw question there, and hope, and something that might have been resolve. "Robert around?" "He's in the barn checking on the hay delivery. Should be back in an hour or so." Jake nodded, but made no move to go find Robert. Instead, he leaned against the porch railing and gazed out over the pasture where cattle grazed peacefully in the morning sun. "Nice day," he said. "Beautiful." Sarah joined him on the porch, maintaining the careful distance they had observed since their conversation at the cabin. "Jake, is everything all right? You seem different this morning." He turned to look at her again, and this time she saw the determination in his expression clearly. "Henderson made his final offer yesterday," he said quietly. "For the partnership. He needs an answer by Friday." Friday. 3 days away. The timeline that had seemed so generous a month ago suddenly felt compressed and urgent. "What did you tell him?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew. "That I needed to talk to someone first." Jake's voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the underlying emotion. "That my decision depended on factors beyond just the ranch." They stood in silence for several minutes, watching a red-tailed hawk circle overhead. Sarah felt the weight of the moments settling around them like morning mist. Decision time had arrived, whether she felt ready or not. "How has it been?" Jake asked softly. "The last 3 weeks with Robert?" Sarah considered lying, offering some hopeful assessment of her husband's efforts to save their marriage. But she was tired of pretending, tired of protecting everyone's feelings except her own. Exactly as you predicted, she said. He tried for a few days, then went back to treating me like furniture that occasionally speaks. Jake nodded grimly. And how do you feel about that? The question forced her to examine emotions she had been trying to keep carefully contained. How did she feel about Robert's failure to change? About the confirmation that their marriage was beyond saving? Relieved, she admitted, surprised by the truth of the word. I'm relieved that I don't have to feel guilty anymore about wanting something better. I'm relieved that I gave him every possible chance and can move forward without regret. And scared? Jake prompted gently. Terrified, Sarah confessed. Absolutely terrified. But also excited in a way I haven't felt in years. Jake's smile was soft and understanding. That's normal. Any major life change is terrifying, even when it's the right choice. Sarah looked toward the barn where Robert was working, oblivious to the conversation that would determine his future. In a few hours, she would have to tell him she was leaving. The thought made her stomach clench with anxiety. How do I do this, Jake? How do I look him in the eye and destroy his world? You look him in the eye and tell him the truth, Jake replied. That you both deserve better than what you have. That staying together isn't helping either of you grow or be happy. That divorce isn't a failure, it's an acknowledgement that you're incompatible in fundamental ways. The word divorce still sent a chill through Sarah, but it no longer felt impossible. She had spent weeks mentally rehearsing the conversation, finding words to express her decision with kindness but firmness. Will you stay until I talk to him? She asked. I don't think I can do this alone. Jake's expression grew troubled. Sarah, I want to support you, but my being here when you tell Robert might make things worse. He might think this is about me stealing his wife rather than about your marriage being broken. She knew he was right, but the thought of facing Robert's hurt and anger without any support felt overwhelming. But you'll be here afterward? When he's had time to process? I'll be wherever you need me to be, Jake promised. For as long as you need me to be there. The sound of Robert's footsteps on the gravel path ended their conversation. Jake straightened and moved away from Sarah, resuming the professional distance that had characterized their interactions for so many years. But Sarah could feel the change between them, the acknowledgement of their shared future, the quiet anticipation of life beyond subterfuge and careful boundaries. Morning, Jake, Robert called as he approached the house. Hay delivery looks good. Premium quality alfalfa, just what the cattle need heading into winter. Good to hear, Jake replied, his voice carefully neutral. Speaking of winter preparations, I wanted to talk to you about my work schedule. Mind if we sit for a minute? Robert glanced between Jake and Sarah, perhaps sensing undercurrents he couldn't identify. Sure. Sarah, bring us some coffee? The automatic assumption that she would serve them rankled, but Sarah bit back her irritation. Soon enough, Robert would have to get his own coffee. She busied herself in the kitchen while the two men settled on the porch. Through the window, she could see them talking quietly, Jake's expression serious, Robert's growing puzzled and, then, concerned. She couldn't hear their words, but she could see the moment when Jake told him about the Henderson offer. Robert's face went through several expressions, surprise, hurt, something that might have been betrayal. When she brought out the coffee tray, both men were silent. Robert stared at his boots while Jake gazed out over the pasture with studied casualness. Jake's leaving, Robert announced without looking up. Taking a partnership with Henderson. I see, Sarah said carefully. When? End of the week, Jake replied. I wanted to give you both time to find a replacement and make arrangements. Robert's laugh was bitter. Time to find a replacement. Right. Because 15 years of friendship and partnership can be replaced in a few days. Sarah felt a stab of sympathy for her husband. Whatever their marital problems, losing Jake would be a genuine blow to him personally and professionally. Robert, I'm not leaving because I'm unhappy here, Jake said quietly. This ranch has been like home to me. You've been like a brother. But opportunities like the Henderson partnership don't come along often, and I'm not getting any younger.
Bullshit, Robert said with uncharacteristic bluntness. This is about money. Henderson's offering you something I can't match. Jake's silence was answer enough.
Sarah could see him wrestling with the desire to defend himself and the knowledge that the full truth would be more hurtful than Robert's assumptions. Maybe it is about money, Robert continued, his voice gaining heat. Maybe you've decided that loyalty doesn't pay as well as ambition. The unfairness of the accusation clearly stung Jake, but he absorbed it without defending himself.
Sarah admired his restraint even as she felt anger rise in her chest on his behalf. That's enough, Robert, she said quietly.
Both men looked at her in surprise. She rarely involved herself in their professional discussions, and never with such firmness.
Jake doesn't owe us his entire career, she continued.
He's been a loyal friend and employee for 15 years. The least we can do is wish him well in his new venture.
Robert's expression shifted as he registered the unusual vehemence in his wife's defense of the ranch foreman. Sarah saw suspicion dawn in his eyes, followed by something darker.
Funny how quick you are to take his side, Robert said slowly.
Anyone might think you had a personal interest in Jake's happiness.
The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire, dangerous, spreading, capable of consuming everything in its path. Sarah felt her heart rate spike as she realized their careful secret was about to be exposed in the worst possible way. I have a personal interest in treating people fairly, she replied, fighting to keep her voice steady.
Jake has earned our respect and gratitude, not our resentment.
But Robert was studying her face now with the focused attention he usually reserved for sick cattle or broken equipment. She could see him processing details he had previously overlooked: Jake's frequent presence around the house, their easy conversations, the way they worked together in the garden or kitchen with comfortable familiarity.
How long? He asked suddenly. Sarah's blood turned to ice water. How long what? How long have you two been fucking behind my back?
The crude language was so unlike Robert that Sarah flinched. She could see Jake tensing beside her, preparing to intervene or deny or protect her somehow.
Robert, she began.
Don't lie to me, he interrupted, standing up so quickly his chair rocked backward. I may be emotionally unavailable, but I'm not blind. The way you look at each other, the way you defend him, the way you've been picking fights with me lately, it all makes sense now. Sarah felt the careful plan she had constructed for this conversation crumbling around her. She had wanted to approach the subject of divorce gently, to focus on their incompatibility rather than her feelings for Jake. Now she found herself backed into a corner, forced to confront accusations that were technically untrue but emotionally accurate.
We haven't been sleeping together, she said quietly. We've never been physically inappropriate. But you want to be, Robert pressed. You're in love with him. The direct question demanded a direct answer.
Sarah looked at her husband, really looked at him, and saw hurt and betrayal warring with anger in his expression. Whatever his faults as a husband, he didn't deserve to discover her feelings this way.
Yes, she said simply. I am in love with him. Robert's face went white, then red, then white again. For a moment, Sarah thought he might hit something or someone.
Instead, he turned away from both of them and gripped the porch railing so tightly his knuckles showed white.
How long? He asked again, his voice barely controlled.
Years, Sarah admitted.
But, Robert, we never acted on it.
We maintained appropriate boundaries because we both respected you and our marriage. Appropriate boundaries, Robert repeated with a harsh laugh. While planning to run off together the moment my back was turned.
Jake finally spoke. It's not like that, Robert. Sarah came to me 3 weeks ago, after trying one more time to work things out with you.
She gave your marriage every possible chance.
3 weeks ago, Robert said slowly. Right after our big conversation about emotional intimacy and feeling lonely.
He turned back to face Sarah, his expression a mixture of pain and understanding.
That fancy dinner.
The questions about love and desire. You weren't trying to save our marriage, you were building a case for leaving it.
Sarah felt tears threaten as she saw the hurt in Robert's eyes.
He was right, at least partially. Her final attempt to reach him had been as much about proving their incompatibility as about creating genuine connection. "I was trying to do both," she said truthfully. "I wanted to give us one last chance, but I also needed to know for certain that we couldn't make each other happy."
"And you decided we couldn't." "We decided we couldn't," Sarah corrected gently. "You said yourself that you don't understand emotional intimacy, that you're not good at reading people, that feelings aren't something you value much. Those aren't flaws, Robert, they're just differences. But they're differences that make us fundamentally incompatible as romantic partners." Robert was quiet for a long time, processing her words. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat and emotionless. "So you're leaving me for him?" "I'm leaving you for me," Sarah replied. "Because I deserve to be with someone who sees me as more than a capable ranch hand. Because I deserve to feel desired and valued and emotionally connected to my partner. Jake and I haven't made specific plans, we're just two people who care about each other and want to see if we can build something real together." "After destroying what I built," Robert said bitterly. "What you built was already destroyed," Jake said quietly. "Sarah was dying in this marriage, Robert. Anyone could see it except you." Robert spun toward Jake with fury blazing in his eyes. "Don't you dare lecture me about my wife. Don't you dare stand there and pretend you're rescuing her when you're just a vulture picking over the bones of my marriage." "That's enough," Sarah said sharply, stepping between the two men before the conversation could escalate further. "Jake didn't destroy our marriage, Robert. We did that ourselves through years of neglect and emotional disconnection. Jake just offered me a chance to start over with someone who actually wants to know who I am inside." The fight seemed to go out of Robert all at once. His shoulders sagged, and he suddenly looked older than his 53 years. "I provided for you," he said quietly. "I worked 18-hour days to keep this place running, to give you security and a good life. I never cheated, never gambled, never spent money on anything but necessities. I thought that was enough." "It would have been enough for some women," Sarah said gently. "But not for me. I needed more than financial security, Robert. I needed emotional connection and physical affection and the feeling that my partner was genuinely interested in my thoughts and dreams and fears. I don't know how to do those things," Robert admitted. "I don't know how to be the kind of man you need." The confession broke Sarah's heart because it was absolutely true. Robert couldn't become emotionally fluent any more than she could become satisfied with purely practical partnership. They were simply incompatible at a fundamental level. "I know," she said softly. "And that's not your fault. But staying married isn't helping either of us become the people we're meant to be." As the morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the porch where their 15-year marriage was finally ending, Sarah felt the strange mix of grief and relief that comes with the conclusion of something that should have ended long ago. There would be lawyers and paperwork and difficult conversations with family and friends. There would be gossip and judgment and the challenge of starting over at 42. But there would also be the possibility of waking up next to someone who was genuinely glad to see her each morning. The possibility of conversations that went deeper than cattle prices and weather reports. The possibility of feeling truly alive again. Robert walked into the house without another word, and Sarah knew he was going to call his lawyer. The practical side of divorce would begin immediately: division of property, settlement negotiations, the legal dissolution of their union. The emotional work of healing would take much longer. Jake moved closer to her as Robert's footsteps faded into the house. "Are you all right?" Sarah wiped tears from her cheeks and took a shaky breath. "I will be. We all will be, eventually." "I'm sorry it happened this way," Jake said. "I had hoped we could tell him more gently." "Maybe this was better," Sarah replied. "Quick and clean, like pulling off a bandage. No room for false hope or drawn-out negotiations." As they stood together on the porch, not quite touching but no longer maintaining careful distance, Sarah felt the weight of 15 years lifting from her shoulders. The future was uncertain and frightening, but, for the first time in years, it was also filled with possibility. Friday, when Jake gave his final answer to Henderson, she would be ready to walk into that uncertain future beside him.
Whatever came next, she would face it as a woman who had finally found the courage to choose her own happiness over everyone else's expectations. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the kitchen of the small farmhouse that came with Jake's partnership at the Henderson Ranch. Sunlight streamed through curtains she had sewn herself, bright yellow fabric that would have seemed too cheerful for the somber atmosphere of her former home. Here, surrounded by Jake's books and her own paintings that finally had wall space, the brightness felt perfect. She was frosting a chocolate cake, preparing for a small celebration. Today marked not only Jake's 46th birthday but also the finalization of her divorce from Robert. The legal process had been surprisingly civil once the initial shock wore off. Robert had kept the main ranch, while Sarah received a cash settlement that gave her freedom to start fresh. The sound of Jake's truck in the driveway sent familiar warmth through her chest. Even after 6 months of living together, she still felt a flutter of anticipation when he came home from work. The feeling of being genuinely happy to see her partner was something she had forgotten existed. "Something smells incredible," Jake called as he entered through the back door, hanging his hat on the hook she had installed at his precise height. "Chocolate cake," Sarah replied, turning to receive the kiss he pressed to her temple. "With buttercream frosting, just like your grandmother used to make." Jake's arms circled her waist from behind as he examined her handiwork. "You found her recipe?" "I called your cousin Martha in Wyoming. She was delighted to share it, along with several stories about your childhood that I'm definitely saving for later embarrassment." Jake groaned theatrically. "I knew letting you talk to my family was a mistake." Sarah leaned back against his chest, savoring the solid warmth of him. This easy domesticity still felt miraculous after years of tiptoeing around Robert's moods and expectations. With Jake, she could be playful, affectionate, completely herself without fear of judgment or rejection. "How was your day?" she asked, a question that had become a cherished ritual between them. "Good. The new heifers are settling in well, and Henderson thinks we might be ready to expand the breeding program next spring." Jake rested his chin on her shoulder. "How was yours?" "Productive. I finished the Morrison Commission this morning, and I have 3 new inquiries about portrait work." Sarah's art had experienced an unexpected renaissance since leaving the ranch. With emotional space to breathe and Jake's enthusiastic encouragement, she had rediscovered her passion for painting. Word had spread through the county about her skill with both landscapes and portraits, and she was building a modest but steady clientele. "That's wonderful. Which commission is next?" The fact that Jake knew the details of her work, that he asked follow-up questions and celebrated her successes, still amazed her. Robert had never shown interest in her art beyond vague comments about it being a nice hobby. "The Peterson family wants a portrait of their 3 children," Sarah replied. "Challenging, since the youngest is only 18 months old, but I think I can manage it." Jake turned her in his arms to face him. "You can definitely manage it. You're incredibly talented, Sarah. I love watching you work, the way you lose yourself completely in the painting, the way your face lights up when you capture exactly what you're trying to express." His words warmed her more than any professional compliment could. Jake really saw her, and found value in aspects of her personality that Robert had never even noticed. "Speaking of work," Sarah said, smoothing the collar of his shirt, "Henderson called this afternoon. He wants to discuss making you a full partner instead of just junior partner." Jake's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Really? Did he say why?" "Because the ranch has turned a 20% profit this year, and he knows that's largely due to your innovations in herd management and pasture rotation." The pride in Sarah's voice was unmistakable. She loved being able to celebrate Jake's accomplishments, to witness his professional growth and feel genuinely invested in his success. That's incredible," Jake said slowly. "Full partnership would mean security," Sarah finished. "It would mean this place is really ours, not just a generous arrangement. It would mean we can start planning for the future with confidence." The word future hung between them, laden with possibilities they hadn't yet discussed explicitly. After the trauma of divorce and the adjustment period of living together, they had both been cautious about making long-term plans. But 6 months of domestic happiness had made the possibility of permanent commitment feel natural rather than frightening.
Sarah, Jake said carefully, when you think about the future, what do you see? She considered the question, allowing her mind to explore hopes she had been keeping carefully guarded. I see us growing old together here, she said honestly. I see Sunday morning breakfasts that last for hours because we love talking to each other. I see a vegetable garden big enough to supply half the county, and a studio where I can paint while you work outside. I see hosting dinner parties for friends, and holiday celebrations that feel joyful instead of obligatory. Jake's smile was soft and wondering. And children? The question made Sarah's heart skip. At 43, pregnancy carried risks and no guarantees. But the longing she heard in Jake's voice matched her own secret hope. I see the possibility of children, she said carefully. If we're blessed that way. And if not, I see us building a life so full of love and purpose that we won't feel incomplete. Jake cupped her face in his hands, his thumb tracing her cheekbone with infinite tenderness. I love you, he said. I love your courage in leaving a comfortable but empty life to risk everything for happiness. I love your talent and your kindness and the way you make everything around you more beautiful. I love the woman you've become since you stopped pretending to be satisfied with less than you deserved. Tears gathered in Sarah's eyes as she heard words she had waited decades to hear, not just declarations of love, but specific recognition of her value as a person. I love you too, she whispered. I love your integrity and your gentleness and the way you see potential in everything around you. I love that you waited for me to be ready, that you never pressured me to leave Robert faster than I could manage emotionally. They stood in their sun-filled kitchen, holding each other and marveling at the journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, Sarah had been a woman slowly dying in a marriage that stifled her spirit. Today, she was vibrantly alive, painting again, laughing daily, planning a future with someone who cherished her exactly as she was. The sound of a car in the driveway interrupted their moment. Through the window, Sarah saw a familiar pickup truck that made her stomach clench with anxiety. Robert's here, she said quietly. Jake's arms tightened around her protectively. Do you want me to handle this? No. Whatever he needs to say, I should hear it. They had seen Robert only twice since Sarah moved out, once during a tense meeting with their lawyers, and once when she returned to collect her personal belongings. Both encounters had been civil but strained, with Robert's hurt and anger carefully controlled but never far from the surface. Sarah opened the door before Robert could knock. He stood on their porch looking older and wearier than she remembered, his hair more gray, lines of stress etched deeper around his eyes. Hello, Sarah. Jake. Robert. Sarah stepped aside to let him enter, noting how he surveyed their home with something between curiosity and pain. Can I offer you coffee? No, thank you. I won't stay long. Robert's gaze settled on the chocolate cake cooling on the counter. Birthday celebration? Jake's 46th, Sarah confirmed, feeling oddly defensive about their happiness. Robert nodded stiffly. Well. Happy birthday, Jake. Thank you, Jake replied quietly. How are you, Robert? I'm. Robert paused, seeming to consider various possible answers. I'm managing. The ranch is doing well. Hired 2 new hands to help with the work. Sarah noticed he didn't say he was doing well, only that he was managing and the ranch was successful. She wondered if he was sleeping better, eating properly, taking care of himself in the way she had once handled automatically. I came to tell you both something, Robert continued, his voice gaining strength. And to say something I should have said months ago. He turned to face Sarah directly, his expression more serious than she had ever seen it. I've been doing a lot of thinking since you left. About our marriage, about what went wrong, about things I could have done differently. Sarah tensed, wondering if Robert had come to fight for their relationship or to assign blame for its failure. I want you to know that I understand now why you had to leave, he continued. Not entirely, I may never completely understand emotional needs the way you do, but enough to realize that staying married would have been cruel to both of us. The admission surprised Sarah. She had expected anger or attempts at reconciliation, not acceptance and understanding. You deserved better than I could give you, Robert said simply.
You deserved a partner who could see your emotional needs and respond to them. Someone who could appreciate your art and your intelligence and your capacity for joy. I couldn't be that man, no matter how hard I tried or wanted to be. Tears gathered in Sarah's eyes as she heard Robert acknowledge truths that had taken her years to accept. And, Jake, Robert continued, turning toward the other man, I owe you an apology. I said things 6 months ago that weren't fair. You didn't steal my wife, I lost her through my own emotional limitations long before you offered her an alternative. Jake's expression was cautious but respectful. Robert, I never intended. I know, Robert interrupted. I know you fought your feelings for years out of loyalty to me. I know Sarah tried everything possible to save our marriage before turning to you. The situation wasn't anyone's fault, it was just incompatibility that took us too long to recognize. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Sarah felt a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying begin to lift from her shoulders. Robert's forgiveness and, more importantly, his understanding meant more than she had expected. There's something else, Robert said, his voice growing stronger. I met someone. Sarah's surprise must have shown on her face, because Robert smiled slightly, the first genuine smile she had seen from him in years. Her name is Linda Peterson, Doc Peterson's sister. She's been divorced for 10 years, has 2 teenagers, works as a nurse in Billings. We met when I took a horse to the vet clinic, and we've been talking. That's wonderful, Robert, Sarah said, and meant it completely. Tell me about her. She's practical, Robert said, his eyes brightening as he spoke. Straightforward. She doesn't expect long conversations about feelings, but she laughs at my terrible jokes and appreciates that I'm dependable. We work well together, she's helping me reorganize the ranch books, and I'm teaching her to ride. Sarah could hear in Robert's voice the same contentment she had found with Jake, the relief of being with someone who appreciated his particular qualities rather than trying to change his fundamental nature. I'm so happy for you, she said sincerely. You deserve to be with someone who values what you have to offer. As do you, Robert replied, glancing between Sarah and Jake. I can see that you're both happy here. The house feels alive in a way ours never did. The observation was perceptive and generous, especially coming from someone who had been hurt by their choices. We are happy, Sarah confirmed. Happier than I thought possible. Robert nodded and moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. Sarah, I want you to know that I don't regret our marriage. It may not have ended well, but we had some good years. And if we hadn't married, you wouldn't have met Jake, and I wouldn't have learned enough about my own limitations to appreciate Linda's practical nature. The sentiment was unexpectedly touching, a recognition that their failed marriage had been a necessary step in both their journeys toward appropriate partnerships. I don't regret it either, Sarah said truthfully. We both learned important things about ourselves and what we need in a relationship. After Robert left, Sarah and Jake sat on their front porch.